There's one person that we know does concern Donald Trump and certainly undermines him, and that's Jeffrey Epstein, the spectre of Jeffrey Epstein from beyond the grave, at one point his best friend, before they had a falling out. Does his name ever come up when you're talking to young people?
It did. It came up. We did a focus group this past weekend. Basically, kind of two promises that this young man remembered, right? One is, are you going to kind of give me a fighting chance, right, to live my best life, and are you going to release the Epstein files? Literally, that is what he said. Those two things.
I'm Joanna Coles. This is the Daily Beast podcast, and today we're going to be talking about young men and how important they were in helping Donald Trump get elected and how they feel about him now, 10 months into his Trump 2.0. Who else to talk about this with but Della Volpe? You may remember he came onto the podcast in the summer, shedding light about poll numbers. He is the director of the Institute of Politics at Harvard, and he is here brimming with all the latest poll numbers and deep insight into what young men in particular are feeling about their place in America today. So, no more time to waste. Della Volpe, let's get into it. So, John, we haven't spoken since the death of Charlie Kirk. What have you been up to?
I've been on the road as much as I possibly can. I mean, I'm on campus, 1 or 2 days a week, but to do my job well, Joanna, I need to be out to America, right? So, I don't know, I've been to Atlanta, St. Louis, Denver, a bunch of other places, listening and talking to people. And there's been some significant reflections post Charlie Kirk, but really I think what I'm picking up is this strong feeling that the system is just broken, it's not working. Charlie Kirk was a vehicle for many young people, but there's an opportunity I'm hearing and picking up in America for more people to do more listening, to empower people who want to be a part of politics and trying to save this democracy.
Do you think that Turning Point USA is going to have the same impact with a woman at its head? Charlie Kirk was a charismatic leader. He was also a young man. Is it likely that Erica Kirk can inspire the same kind of connection that her late husband did?
Well, I wouldn't rule anything out, okay? We find that if you take a step back, right, that younger men, in many cases, some younger men, right, were connected to Kirk, but a lot of other younger men were connected to one of the most elderly politicians in America today, Bernie Sanders, right? So it's not always like a one-to-one younger men, connected with only other younger men who look like them, right? So I wouldn't rule out the fact that younger men can be kind of attracted to other kind of prominent figures who may not be reflecting their specific identity, right? What's more important than that?
Do you think they can, can you give me examples of where they've related to a woman in this sort of situation?
Some of AOC's supporters, some of her strongest supporters are younger men. So if the question is, can younger conservative men, be attracted to Erica Kirk? That's a different question. Okay, so what does she represent? Does she represent having a space where younger people can ask difficult questions? Okay, and perhaps she won't likely have the same approach that he had, but could she still create that space where younger people feel comfortable asking questions? Charlie Kirk, wasn't Charlie Kirk 10 years ago when he started, right? He was a frustrated young high school student, right? Who wanted to create community and wanted to find other young conservative, kind of religious, faithful people who he could spend time with, which ultimately grew into one of the most significant political movements, in the century, I think, okay? So it doesn't necessarily need to be the same playbook, but what it needs to be, I think, to attract any younger person around politics today, because there is such disdain for institutions, is we need to collectively find places where younger people find community, where there is a shared culture, which ultimately can be developed into political positions, ideology, organizing. My point here is that can happen on the right. It can happen on the left. And there are more people on the left whose values align with kind of progressive ideology, but they don't have that space. So I wrote a piece, Joanna, in the New York Times just a couple of days after Kirk's assassination, and I kind of broke it out and I said there are 4 or 5 steps I think that are worth studying that made Kirk, that helped elect the president of the United States. It was hard work. He was engaging. The right was engaging. And whether, again, his widow and his colleagues can take it to the right, that's one thing, okay? But my point is there should be an opportunity to do the same thing on the left, and that's what I've been waiting for decades.
Well, what is the oligarchy tour then? Both AOC and Bernie Sanders are charismatic leaders. Haven't they created a space?
They've created a movement, but it's different, I think, because it's a campaign, okay? It's still about politics first, okay? And what Kirk did, okay, was create spaces outside of politics. Not everyone wants to be talking about oligarchy 24/7, 365, okay? They want to be talking about their day-to-day lives. That's what I find in every single focus group room that I enter. People seem to be nervous when we walk in thinking it's going to be a political debate or quiz or something. But when we end up just asking about how their day's going, what's a good day, what stresses them out, what their life is like, what we don't understand, they feel empowered and they ask me when they can do this again. Those are the kinds of spaces I'm talking about, okay, where they're based upon community and culture. And then you get to talking about the oligarchs. You get to talking about, why the system is, in their view, kind of preventing them from living their best life, perhaps the lives that their parents, led just 25 or so years ago, okay? My point is that Kirk led with culture first, with community first, and then politics followed. And I do think that there's an opportunity on the left, AOC, Sanders, we certainly see this in New York City right now, with Mondami. I think Mondami perhaps has as much of an ability as anyone I've seen to actually kind of extend his appeal in this conversation beyond just an election into something kind of bigger, that gives people kind of a stake and makes people feel heard, and that's important.
Is this the sort of place that traditionally churches or mosques or temples would have played in people's lives, and then COVID sort of slowed down what was already a dwindling of people going to these places, and now people are still looking for the same things that they used to talk about in church or in mosques or temples, but they don't physically turn up at them anymore. They go to the gym on a Sunday morning or a Friday night instead.
Yes, and this is not just like a post-COVID 5-year phenomenon. This is a decades-long phenomenon, from I think one of the most important sociologists, in our history, Robert Putnam, talked about, probably 2 decades ago in Bowling Alone, right? It's how we're losing social capital in connection to our friends, our neighbors, our fellow citizens, because, he argued after the Second World War, we moved out to suburbs. Air conditioning was on. We weren't walking. We weren't enjoying each other's company in bowling alleys and clubs and those sorts of things. So this has been decades, I think, in the making. But I think the really interesting and really good news is, as again, someone who cares about reconnecting the social fabric, is actually a return to church, to temple, to mosque. In fact, specifically among younger people. In fact, there's been a lot of research just in the last couple of years. There are actually more members of millennial generation and Gen Z attending services than Gen Xers and baby boomers. So that's something to keep a close eye on. And I've actually spent some time talking with folks just in the last couple of months about this very subject, about the role of religion and faith and showing up on a to a service or using apps and television, et cetera. And what I'm hearing is it's actually a place to disconnect, right? And to be present. And what's interesting, I think, about this generation is there is this return to traditional religion. And part of that, I think, is an antidote to the overwhelming stress that people feel when they're connected to their phones, right? And that, by definition, is a place you can't do that. You need to see each other and be present. And it's a trend worth picking up. It's more, I think, prevalent on the Charlie Kirk side of the political spectrum, but it's not. I think we're seeing similar interest in rebuilding faith communities on the left as well.
Okay, super interesting, and possibly a very positive sign for society. People understanding that the smartphone isolates them and craving to get back to company and actually being in person with people. So, what are the polls telling you right now about where, in particular, young men are? We've talked before about young men being such an important constituency for Donald Trump to get elected. How are they feeling 1 year in, or I guess it's 10 months into his actual rule, but it's a year since the election?
We're all familiar with those traditional questions. Do you approve? Do you disapprove? Fave, unfave, right track, wrong track. The question that I ask on a monthly basis, Joanna, in a monthly poll I do at my company, Social Sphere, is, I think, more direct, which is Donald Trump having a positive or negative impact on your life, okay, or no difference? And what we found in January, 10 days or so before the inauguration, we found among younger men, a majority, 55%, said having a positive impact. Okay, and most of that obviously was around feeling heard and the potential for economic strength and kind of a return for younger men feeling like they could be the providers that they want to be. Okay, that was 55%.
Right, and push back against DEI and the fear of cancellation for saying what you actually think.
Exactly. All of those things. All of those things. Okay. Only 22% said negative, more than 2 to 1. Okay. The last wave of this survey that I did, it was just less than a month ago, it was end of September, and the 55% number went to 31%.
Wow, okay. That's a big drop.
Less than a third say he's having a positive impact on their life, okay? And 43% say it's negative, okay? So the way we think about this is, in January, he had a plus 33, okay? 33 points net positive impact. Mm-hmm. Today, minus 12.
Minus 12.
Okay? That's a 45-point shift, okay, in 9 months.
Is that the biggest shift you've ever seen? That seems pretty dramatic.
It's up there. I'll tell you something. Women, shifted 41 points, okay? They were net zero, okay? As many thought positive as negative. And now it's 18 positive impact, 59 negative impact.
What is the reason for that? Why are they feeling more negative than they were just before the inauguration?
I think it is just really simple, which is every time they walk out of their house or their apartment, if they're lucky to have one, okay, everything costs more than it did a year ago, right? Everything costs more than a year ago. When I looked at the overall feelings of the economy, I looked at the Economist YouGov survey over the weekend, and a majority of all Americans, the highest number in the last year, think the economy is off on the wrong track, and we can see that reflected in everybody, specifically younger people. They're 10 points more likely today than when Biden was in office a year ago to say that the economy is off on the wrong track. So much of it is driven by that one, and then also I think they're looking at the East Room. They're looking at Venezuela. They're looking at, myriad of these other issues, and they're seeing through them, and they believe it's cynical. We ask these kinds of questions in the polling, from the National Guard in Washington, D.C., through some of these other issues. They feel like they're basically an distraction from what is the reason that so many younger men voted for him in the first place. Is ultimately, he promised to help them be a better provider. And many are beginning to feel betrayed.
So really, young men are impacted by the demolition of the East Wing of the White House?
I think that's just the latest in a string of what they see as distractions from President Trump doing what he promised younger people to do, right? Which is to improve the economy so they themselves could be better providers for themselves and the people that they care about. And they gave him some slack. We talked, last time we were on the pod together, we talked about the slack that younger people were giving him some time, give him, some opportunity to get his team in place, to see the effect of the tariffs, et cetera. But I think that time for many young people is kind of running out for him. He needs to begin to deliver on the core promise. And when you have only 31% of younger men saying he's making their life better, I can't think of a worse number for him right now. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean, though, that the 69%, who think that there's been no impact or it's negative, are voting for Democrats. Okay, that's the different dynamic in this cycle compared to his first term, I think, at this point in 2017. That's a different dynamic. And Democrats cannot make the mistake that just because they disapprove, just because they think Trump is actually hurting them financially, that they're going to, end up voting in large numbers for Democrats. Outside of New York City, in a week or so from now, I don't see that happening at this moment.
Are they impacted at all, or are you getting feedback from them on the government shutdown? We're 1 month in now, and it feels like the most under-talked about government shutdown, certainly in living memory.
Yeah, I just think there's exhaustion. I was on the road doing focus groups in the earliest days of that shutdown. It was just exhaustion, and that both there wasn't like a big surprise that they blame essentially kind of both parties and the system for doing this. I don't think it's a subject. I don't think it came up over the weekend during my focus groups. It's not a subject that I'm picking up or hearing from the rank and file people that I talk to kind of at this point. If anything, it drives people to kind of the anti-establishment pathway of trying to make change. I don't think they see at this point the folks I'm talking about. I'm sure we can find a poll that shows Democrats are winning or the Republicans are winning. I don't think that matters. I think that the shutdown is doing grave damage to further damage to institutions, Congress, Washington, politics, government. That's the real damage, and it's driving people outside of the system. And that's something that I'm not sure either leader of both parties really fully appreciates.
So you're hearing negatives on Donald Trump, but you're not hearing much positive about the Democrats. If you were advising the Democrats, what would you suggest they do to counteract this?
Well, I think what you said, Joanna, was an understatement when you said you're not hearing much positive about Democrats. So one of my favorite questions to ask in focus groups was, if the parties were people, who would they be? Okay, what would they look like? Okay, if they showed up in a bar, if they showed up, in whatever.
What an interesting question. I wish I'd met you when I was at college, because I would love to have been involved in something like this.
This was a young man said this just a couple of days ago. He said, without hesitation, he said, Democrat is the HR department. It's the human resource department, okay? They act like they really care about you, but they actually work for the man. They actually work for the company, Okay. Like, think about that, right? Who wants to be visited by the HR department? Okay, it's never good news, right? If you're going to get a raise or a promotion, the boss is going to come in, not the HR department, right? The HR department is going to likely kind of grind you down with policy or telling you something that needs to be changed, needs to be adapted to, not a conversation you really ever want to have, or a person to necessarily be around. And no offense to any of the great HR people out there, but that's the vibe that younger people are feeling about the Democratic Party right now.
I know. I was feeling slightly defensive about our HR person, who is a great contributor to the Daily Beast, I would say. Lisa Marie, if you're listening to this, I'm giving you a shout out. But it was one of the criticisms of Kamala Harris, right? That she appeared to be a scold, and that you're always nervous when the HR department shows up that you've inadvertently offended somebody by saying something that you hadn't thought twice about. And that, I think, is what the Democrats have been wrestling with a bit. This sense that we are all on the edge of offending someone else and being told off for it.
Exactly. And then the other piece, okay, is we heard this about both Democrats and Republicans, that if they walked into a room, they would actually be wearing one of those NASCAR type sweaters, right? Or uniforms where you have the corporate logos, okay? Affixed to every part of your jacket or your sweater or your shirt, representing all of the people who own a piece of you, okay? And that exact metaphor was used for both the Democrats as well as the Republicans. So there's just not a lot of distance, I think, in terms of, quote, the oligarchy. Younger people are seeing both parties writ large driven by them. And what I think a lot of folks don't perhaps appreciate is younger people. And that's the reaction. You need to kind of break that image of Democrats if you're going to have a meaningful conversation about what the future looks like. This is a party. This is a group of voters, I think, who are more rational, more pragmatic, perhaps, than we might appreciate, and therefore, I think, are searching much more for anti-establishment than any necessarily ideological purity. There are going to be a number of people who voted for Donald Trump and also for Zohran Mamdani, as an example, in New York City, okay, who went Sanders, Trump, Mamdani, right? That's not about ideology. It's about, are you fighting the system or you're part of the system?
And it's also about charismatic leadership, that all three men are apparently fearless and apparently say what they believe, as opposed to parroting a sort of thought-out policy put together by committee. There's one person that we know does concern Donald Trump and certainly undermines him, and that's Jeffrey Epstein, the spectre of Jeffrey Epstein from beyond the grave, at one point his best friend, before they had a falling out. Does his name ever come up when you're talking to young people?
It did. It came up over this weekend. We did a focus group this past weekend, and it was from that Trump Mamdani, a person. And again, it's, basically kind of two promises that this young man remembered, right? One is, are you going to kind of give me a fighting chance, right, to live my best life? And, are you going to release the Epstein files? Literally, that is what he said, those two things. So that was one of the very first times, honestly, of the probably 50 focus groups I've done, that his name came up organically, but it did come up, and it came up within this like anti-establishment. Maybe he's not what exactly he promised to be. Listen, I think that Trump and the Republicans, obviously, and Kirk, all kind of connected to helping elect him to the White House. And as much work I think Democrats have to do, but Republicans are on shaky ground with young people, with younger men. And what we all need to appreciate is the voters in 2028. Many of the voters in 2026 weren't part of the 24 election, okay? Those voters came of age during the Biden term, okay? The post-COVID effect, isolation, loneliness, inflation, a feeling of America was weaker, not stronger.
And government overreach, insisting that kids wore masks to schools, insisting on everybody staying at home when clearly it was having a terrible impact on mental health and the economy.
100%. Okay. That was what younger men and many younger women brought into the electorate, and that's a lot of how they made their decisions based upon that reaction. Well, today's high school students, young college students, young people in the workforce, okay, they're making their kind of political identity is being developed, okay, through the first year of the Trump 2.0 term, okay? Mostly all of it is negative, as I shared about those numbers, okay? So that is going to be the vibe that they're taking in 26 and in 28 in terms of he's not delivering what he said. There's more chaos. There's less safety. There's more economic concern, right? What is he doing about that? So he can't count on that. There was a significant backlash in the 2018 midterms. There could be a significant backlash again in 26, but only if Democrats take the page out of what Kirk did, organizing, and what Mamdani and others are doing, listening, and really begin to make meaningful connections beyond just those algorithmic, data feeds that they seem to be using at the expense of actually truly listening.
That's so interesting. I was going to ask you about algorithms and social media, and to what extent does it ever come up that the Chinese own TikTok, which is one of the most powerful drivers of political discussion in the United States? Is this something that any of the people you've talked to show concern about? Do they show an understanding that everything you see on social media isn't necessarily true?
They're deeply concerned about that. I don't know. I mean, we've asked some questions. The role of Chinese ownership, honestly, hasn't kind of come up recently, but what does come up is almost by default is younger people, specifically younger men, saying like, we don't want to see this, right? We're fed this often kind of far right, misogynistic, violent content that we don't want to be a part of, but they get it anyway, right? That's what we're hearing, and again, they're blaming kind of the establishment, right? Younger men, younger people want far more government oversight here, right? But they, again, kind of believe that it's those corporate patches, right? That Democrats, Republicans are wearing, okay? Representing, by big tech and Silicon Valley. And they know that is harming them through their mental health and ultimately through their physical health. And that's why we talked, just a couple of minutes ago, that they're trying to find anything they can do to unplug, whether it's showing up in a couple of hours of focus groups where we can't use your phone, or showing up to worship or service or something like that, right? So I think kind of younger people are more aware than anyone else of the content that they're seeing, and they're essentially asking institutions to help them help themselves. But again, just another indication of government failing to deliver something that they're asking for.
So they think both political parties are corrupt, and they're looking for leaders who appear to be free of the ribbons of corruption that tie them to the big parties, which Bernie certainly does seem to be, and AOC, and indeed Mamdani.
That's right. I think the biggest divide in this country today, Joanna, is the divide between people who feel heard versus people who feel unheard. And the most successful politicians are going to be the ones from either party who let people feel heard. That's a lesson I've taken from the last years of my research.
Well, as the mother of two sons, I find it astonishing, the idea that young men don't think they're heard because their voices are very loud most of the time. Do you have a prediction for what are the polls telling you about what's going to happen in New York and Virginia and New Jersey?
Yeah, well, all the polls are saying that, Mamdani has a strong double-digit lead. He's leading across every major demographic group that we can see. And in Virginia, it was expected for quite a while, right? That's a state that tends to flip. That Spanberger would win is a question of by how much, right? And most of the polling now is showing, a double-digit lead and win is possible with, I think, a more narrow potential victory in New Jersey. But that trifecta next week could really begin to change a dynamic, and I think give younger people and also other kind of Democrats and progressives some hope moving into 26.
Okay, well, it's good to know that young men care about the demolition of the East Wing too, traditionally the home of the First Lady. I'd love to have you back to talk further about Turning Point USA and how you replace someone like Charlie Kirk. I understand Erica's gone in there, but one of the points of charismatic leadership is that sense that they're incredibly hard to follow and that often what they do is tear down the institutions that people are used to, but you can't replace them once they've gone. You just inherit the chaos. So I'm very curious to see what happens at Turning Point and whether or not it continues its impact on young men. John, thank you so much for coming on and telling us yet again that young men must be heard and are feeling unheard. What are you up to next?
Well, we are watching, obviously, the early voting in as many states as we can, and I have my 51st Harvard poll in the field now. I'm so excited about that, and we'll be reporting that right after Thanksgiving time, so look for that soon.
Okay, and let me ask you one final question then. Do polls still have a role in the world of Polymarket?
I think they are driving Polymarket, actually, and I think that unfortunately, this is maybe for the next pod. I think, Joanna, I think they have too much of a role in terms of shaping the conversation. We should be looking at the top line numbers, but it's the conversations like the ones that we've had, right? The qualitative research that gives voice and humanity to the polling and the Polymarket. That, I think, is what we need to be spending more time on, not whatever the chances are of some person winning or losing. That is where I think polling oftentimes is misused.
Okay, so you're off to do more polling, talk to more people, hear more young men. I'm sure they will be thrilled. We will look forward to seeing you after Thanksgiving.
See you soon. Thanks.
So there you have it from John Della Volpe, real insights into how alienated young male voters in particular feel from the institutions of America that are supposed to make them feel tucked in and protected and that they have a big future in America. Always fascinating. And as the mother of two sons, as I said to John, I find it extraordinary that young men don't find themselves heard because they are so noisy. And yet clearly they do feel alienated. And it's something both parties need to take heed of. We'll be back with John after Thanksgiving with his latest insights. If you have been, thank you for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe to The Daily Beast. Please subscribe to this podcast. Leave us a review if you're on Apple and Spotify. Leave us a comment if you're on YouTube. And join the Daily Beast community. It's super fun. You get extra op-ed videos, you get extra content, and you get access to me and other members of the Daily Beast staff and even Michael Wolff. And don't forget, if you're up for coming to see Michael Wolff and me live, we'll be at the City Museum of New York next week, actually, next Wednesday, November the 5th, from 6:30 to 8. Bring questions, bring your friends, come for a night out. It'll be the night after the New York mayoral election, so there'll be some insights there. But Michael, of course, will be digging inside Trump's head and bringing you the latest of everything he's hearing from deep within the White House. If you haven't been this week, it's time. Be Beast. And a shout out to our top tier Be Beast members, Karen White, Heidi Riley, Connie Rutherford, Sharon Shipley, Andrea Hodel, and Free DC. And thank you to our production team, Devon Rogerino, Anna von Ursen, and our editor, Jesse Millward.